Imagine for a moment that you're scrolling through your favorite online marketplace. You're browsing listings for old coins, used cars, maybe some furniture, and then you see it. It's a new listing, posted just minutes ago, with a title that makes your heart stop. It reads, "For sale, the United States of America, one of a kind, includes executive, legislative, and judicial branches, military, tax revenue, and all federal lands included. Starting bid, $1 trillion, local pickup only." It sounds like a joke, right? A plot from a terrible movie. It's an idea so absurd, so fundamentally corrupt, that it's almost impossible to comprehend. But in the year 193 AD, in the capital of the most powerful state the world had ever known, this wasn't a joke. This actually happened. The Roman Empire, in all its magnificent and terrifying glory, was quite literally put up for public auction. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguards, murdered their boss and then offered the throne to the highest bidder. And a wealthy, ambitious, and catastrophically misguided senator named Didius Julianus actually bought it. This is the true story of the Roman emperor who purchased the world's greatest empire, and the disastrous 66 days he spent trying to keep his prize. The year of chaos. To understand how a situation so utterly insane could possibly arise, we have to look at the state of the Roman Empire in the late 2nd century. Rome was coming off one of its best periods in history, the era of the 5 good emperors. This was a remarkable run of rulers: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, who had presided over a century of relative peace, stability, and prosperity. But this golden age came to a screeching, violent halt with the man who followed them, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor Commodus. Commodus was, to put it mildly, a disaster. Where his father was a stoic philosopher-king, Commodus was a narcissistic, paranoid megalomaniac. He neglected the duties of state in favor of his own hedonistic pleasures. He saw himself as the reincarnation of the demigod Hercules, and to the utter horror of the Roman elite, he would enter the gladiatorial arena himself, fighting against terrified, often crippled opponents and wild animals in carefully staged contests. His reign was a 13-year-long spectacle of corruption, extravagance, and terror. By the end, he had alienated the Senate, the people, and the military. On New Year's Eve of the year 192 AD, a group of conspirators, including his own chamberlain and his favorite concubine, had him strangled in his bath. The conspirators and the Senate moved quickly to fill the power vacuum. Their choice was Pertinax, a respected and disciplined old general, the son of a former slave who had risen through the ranks on pure merit. He was the anti-Commodus in every way, frugal, stern, and dedicated to restoring the traditional Roman virtues. And that was precisely his problem. Pertinax inherited an empire that had been driven to the brink of bankruptcy by Commodus's excesses. The state treasury was empty. To fix this, he immediately instituted a series of harsh but necessary austerity measures. He sold off Commodus's lavish possessions, cut extravagant state expenditures, and set about trying to restore discipline to the military. His most fateful decision was to take on the most powerful and corrupt institution in the city of Rome, the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians were the elite household troops of the emperor, a force of several thousand of the best soldiers in the empire, stationed right there in the capital at their massive fortified camp, the Castra Praetoria. Originally formed as a simple bodyguard unit, they had over the centuries evolved into the ultimate political power brokers. They were the kingmakers, and more often, the king-breakers. They had assassinated emperors like Caligula and Galba. They were accustomed to being pampered, receiving huge salaries and lavish bonuses called donatives from each new emperor. They were, in short, dangerously spoiled. Pertinax, in his effort to restore fiscal discipline, made it clear that the era of extravagant handouts was over. He attempted to enforce stricter discipline, and most critically, he planned to pay them only half of the bonus they had been promised. For the Praetorians, this was an existential threat to their privileged lifestyle and their political power. They had grown fat and lazy under Commodus, and they had no interest in returning to the disciplined life of a common soldier under a stern old general. Their resentment festered for a few short months, and then it exploded. On the 28th of March, 193 AD, after a reign of just 87 days, a mob of several hundred angry and mutinous Praetorian Guards stormed the imperial palace. Pertinax's advisors begged him to flee and hide, but the old emperor was a man of principle and courage. He believed he could reason with his soldiers. He chose to stand his ground and face them down in person, a fatal and tragic miscalculation. As he began to speak, reminding them of their duty and his own legitimacy, they lost their nerve for a moment. But then one soldier, perhaps fearing the consequences if they backed down, hurled a spear and struck the emperor in the chest. The spell was broken. The mob descended on the 66-year-old emperor and brutally murdered him. The Roman Empire was now without a leader. The throne was empty, and the Praetorian Guard had just sent a very clear message to the entire world. The throne belonged to them, and it was now for sale. The imperial auction. What happened next is one of the most shameful and bizarre episodes in Roman history, a moment of such naked corruption that it was recorded with disgust by contemporary historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian. With the Emperor Pertinax dead, the mutinous Praetorian Guards retreated back to the safety of their fortified camp. They barricaded the gates and manned the walls. They were now in a position of supreme power. They had just murdered the head of state, and they knew that whoever they chose as his successor would owe them everything. They held the ultimate prize, the imperial purple, and they decided to dispose of it in the most direct and profitable way imaginable. They would sell it. The news of the emperor's murder spread through the city like a shockwave. The first potential buyer was a man who was already on the scene, Titus Flavius Sulpicianus. Sulpicianus was the current urban prefect, essentially the mayor of Rome, and in a grimly ironic twist, he was also the father-in-law of the man the guards had just killed, Pertinax. He had gone to the Praetorian camp to try and calm the situation down, but when he arrived, he found himself in the middle of a burgeoning auction. Seeing his opportunity, he immediately began to make offers, promising each soldier a massive donative if they would proclaim him emperor. He was the first bidder, but then a challenger arrived. Hearing the commotion from his mansion in the city, another man decided to throw his hat in the ring. This was Didius Julianus. Julianus was the embodiment of the Roman aristocracy. He was in his late 50s, fabulously wealthy, and came from one of the most distinguished senatorial families. He had had a respectable, if not legendary, career, serving as a provincial governor and a general on the frontiers. He was ambitious, vain, and he saw this chaotic moment as his last best chance to seize the ultimate prize that had eluded him his entire life. He hurried from his home, accompanied by his family and a group of clients, and made his way to the walls of the Castra Praetoria. The scene that followed was a complete farce. Julianus and his entourage remained outside the walls of the camp, while his rival, Sulpicianus, negotiated from inside. The Praetorian Guards themselves acted as auctioneers, shouting the bids back and forth over the battlements to the two competing old men. It had become a literal bidding war for control of the known world. Sulpicianus, from inside, made a strong opening offer. He promised every single soldier in the guard a sum of 20,000 sesterces. This was a fortune equivalent to about 5 years' pay for a regular legionary soldier. The guards were tempted. But then Julianus, from his position outside the gates, shouted that he would not make a specific bid, but would simply give them whatever they asked for and would restore the privileges they had lost under Pertinax. Some of Julianus's supporters, in a stroke of genius, brought along ladders and held them up against the walls. They shouted up to the soldiers on the ramparts that Julianus was far wealthier than Sulpicianus and would not cheat them. They also cleverly planted seeds of doubt about Sulpicianus, reminding the guards that he was Pertinax's father-in-law and might well be obligated to avenge his death once he was in power. This argument began to sway the soldiers. Julianus was the safer bet. They urged him to make a concrete offer to seal the deal. So Julianus shouted up his final, spectacular bid. He would pay every single man 25,000 sesterces. This was an astronomical sum. For a guard of roughly 10,000 men, the total payout would be 250 million sesterces. It was a figure so large it would severely cripple the Roman treasury. But for the greedy and short-sighted Praetorians, it was an offer they couldn't refuse. The deal was done. They had found their buyer. They lowered the ladders and invited Didius Julianus to climb up and into the camp. Once inside, they immediately proclaimed him emperor, hailed him as Caesar Augustus, and swore an oath of loyalty to him, an oath purchased with the promise of silver. Didius Julianus, the wealthy senator, had just become the master of the Roman world. He had bought the empire on eBay's ancient equivalent, and he was about to discover the brutal reality of their no-refunds policy. The 66-day emperor, the reign of Didius Julianus began as it would end, in humiliation and chaos. Escorted by the very soldiers who had murdered his predecessor just hours before, their swords still stained, Julianus made his way from the Praetorian camp to the Senate house. He was now the emperor, but the people of Rome were utterly disgusted by the transaction. According to the historian Cassius Dio, as his procession moved through the streets, the citizens who had gathered did not cheer. Instead, they met him with a volley of curses and insults. They called him a thief and a parricide. Some even began to throw stones at the new emperor and his mercenary bodyguards. The Roman people felt that the honor of their empire had been dragged through the mud, sold like a common piece of merchandise in the marketplace. Julianus's reception in the Senate was not much warmer. His fellow senators, many of whom were his peers and rivals, were forced by the presence of the armed Praetorians to officially ratify his accession. They voted him all the necessary titles and powers, but they did so with a silent, seething contempt. The new emperor was a pariah in his own city, a ruler with no popular support and no legitimacy beyond what he had purchased from a cohort of assassins. His problems were just beginning. He immediately faced a catastrophic financial crisis of his own making. He had promised the Praetorians 250 million sesterces, but when he inspected the imperial treasury, he found it nearly empty, a testament to both the excesses of Commodus and the frugal reforms of Pertinax. He was a man who had written a check his empire couldn't cash. To start making payments, he was forced to take drastic measures, devaluing the Roman currency, the denarius, by reducing its silver content. This act of debasement only further angered the populace and the merchant classes. The very foundation of his power, the loyalty of the guards, was already shaky, as he struggled to pay them the fortune he had promised. He was an emperor in name only, the isolated and hated ruler of a single, hostile city. But the real power of Rome did not lie in the city. It lay with the legions, the hardened professional armies stationed hundreds or even thousands of miles away on the empire's vast frontiers. While Julianus was struggling to control Rome, the news of the murder of Pertinax and the shameful auction of the empire reached the frontier camps in Britain, Syria, and along the Danube River. The reaction of the legionary soldiers and their powerful generals was one of universal fury. They had respected Pertinax, one of their own. They were incensed that the pampered, corrupt dandies of the Praetorian Guard had presumed to appoint an emperor without consulting the real military might of the empire. Within weeks, the empire began to fracture. 3 of the most powerful generals in the Roman world, each commanding a massive army of loyal, battle-hardened legions, refused to recognize Julianus's authority. In the province of Britannia, the governor Clodius Albinus was proclaimed emperor by his troops. In Syria, the governor Pescennius Niger, commander of the powerful Eastern legions, also claimed the throne. And most dangerously for Julianus, in the province of Pannonia on the Danube frontier, the governor Lucius Septimius Severus was hailed as emperor by his formidable army. The disastrous Year of the 5 Emperors had begun. Rome was now in a state of open civil war. Of the 3 usurpers, Septimius Severus was the most immediate and existential threat. He was the closest to Italy, and he was a brilliant and utterly ruthless commander. He wasted no time. Forging a temporary alliance of convenience with Albinus in Britain to secure his rear, Severus immediately began to march his 13 powerful Danubian legions on Rome. Back in the capital, Julianus descended into a state of blind panic. He tried to get the Praetorian Guard, his supposed protectors, to prepare the city's defenses, but the Praetorians were a palace guard, not combat engineers or frontline soldiers. They were unaccustomed to hard labor, and they performed their duties of building walls and digging trenches lazily and incompetently. Julianus declared Severus a public enemy and sent a group of assassins to kill him, but they failed. He ordered the Senate to send a delegation to try and negotiate with Severus, but the senators, sensing which way the wind was blowing, deliberately delayed their departure. In a final pathetic act of desperation, Julianus had the Senate declare Severus his co-emperor, hoping to share the power he could no longer hold. Severus simply ignored the offer and continued his relentless march. The final bill comes due. As the unstoppable army of Septimius Severus drew closer and closer to Rome, the Praetorian Guard did what they did best. They looked out for themselves. They had created Julianus, and now they would uncreate him. They were soldiers of fortune, and they could see that their investment in this particular emperor had been a catastrophic failure. They were not willing to die in a hopeless battle against Severus' hardened legions to defend the man they had put on the throne. Secretly, they opened negotiations with Severus. Through intermediaries, they arrested their own emperor and offered to hand him over to Severus in exchange for a full pardon for their murder of Pertinax. The end for Didius Julianus was swift and ignominious. Seeing that his protectors had abandoned him, the Senate, which had lived in fear for the past 2 months, was suddenly emboldened. They convened a meeting, officially declared Julianus a public enemy, sentenced him to death, and formally recognized Septimius Severus as the new emperor of Rome. A single soldier was dispatched to the imperial palace to carry out the sentence. He found Julianus cowering and alone, deserted by all but one of his prefects and his son-in-law. The historical sources record his final pathetic words as he awaited his fate. "But what evil have I done? Whom have I killed?" He was executed on the 1st of June 193 AD. He had reigned for just 66 days. The most expensive purchase in history had ended in the ultimate buyer's remorse. A few days later, Septimius Severus entered Rome without a fight. He had promised the Praetorians a pardon, but Severus was not a man to forget or forgive such a deep betrayal of imperial order. He summoned the entire Praetorian Guard to a parade ground outside the city, ordering them to appear without their armor and weapons as a sign of peaceful submission. The guards complied. As they stood there, defenseless, Severus surrounded them with his own loyal armed legionaries. He then berated them for their cowardice, their greed, and their murder of Pertinax. He did not slaughter them, but he did something almost as devastating. He stripped every single one of them of their rank, their arms, and their prestigious status. He dishonorably discharged the entire guard and banished them from the city of Rome, and from within 100 miles of it, on pain of death. Severus then completely reformed the institution. He disbanded the old, corrupt, Italian-based guard and replaced it with a new, much larger force of 15,000 men, hand-picked from his own loyal, battle-hardened Danubian legions. The Praetorian Guard would continue to exist, but its power as an independent kingmaker was broken, and its character was changed forever. The story of Didius Julianus is more than just a bizarre and entertaining historical footnote. It's a stark and cautionary tale about what happens when the core institutions of a state become so rotten with corruption that power itself becomes just another commodity to be bought and sold. He was a man of immense wealth and ambition who failed to understand a fundamental truth of power. A title bought with money has no legitimacy. The throne of Rome, he discovered far too late, could not be purchased with sesterces. It had to be taken and held by force of arms and the unwavering loyalty of the legions. His absurd and tragic 66-day reign was a humiliating farce that served as the chaotic opening act for the rise of a new ruthless military dynasty under Septimius Severus, a change that would set the Roman Empire on a new and ultimately darker path.